Remember the time when Rishabh Pant stepped out of the crease and gave his wicket during a very crucial time? I exactly remember the commentators explaining his poor shot selection and unnecessary risk taking. In our lives, most of the times we exactly do what Rishabh Pant did in that innings. Without understanding the market scenario or our risk appetite, we might buy a hot stock and may regret that decision for the rest of our lives. In fact, we hardly know what our risk appetite is, and even worse, we hardly bother enough to think about it. Whenever questioned about it, we often express our willingness to take more risks when we shouldn't have done so. Consider it like this: you want to travel to Goa from Mumbai. The total distance of the trip is around 600 kilometers, while you only have 6 liters in your tank. With that, you would hardly reach to Alibag without refueling your vehicle. Now, even if you desperately wanted to go, you cannot go just because your current capacity doesn't allow you to do so. Similarly, while investing, we often ask ourselves what path we want to take. However, we should more importantly ask ourselves that can we actually take this path? Does this fit into my risk profile? That's exactly what we are going to learn today. We are going to help you create your risk profile, and we will help you allocate your investments into a well diversified portfolio based on your risk profile using an Excel sheet. So stay tuned till the end. As you might know that risk is a subjective term, so we have tried to create a standardized scorecard that will help ease this process and make it more comparable. We have evaluated an individual's risk profile on 13 different parameters, in which each parameter can be scored from 1 to 10, with 10 being highest while 1 being lowest in terms of the person's risk appetite. I will tell you my score for each of those 13 parameters, and we will also discuss my risk appetite for the same. So let's get started. First parameter, employment status. Here we try to evaluate the employment status of the investor, and the 5 broad categories are employed, unemployed, business owner, retired, and student. Obviously, an employed investor would have a very high score in this aspect, while an unemployed investor would have a low score. Talking about myself, since I was previously employed by a company in the UK and now I'm currently employed by company in India, I would say that I have a fairly decent score in this aspect, and hence I would give myself a score of 8. Parameter number 2, type of employment. Here we try to see whether the investor has a stagnant income, a regular income with high growth, or a highly volatile income. Obviously, an investor with a highly volatile income would have a very low score, close to 1, while an investor that has a very regular income and that has high growth would have a very high score, close to 10. Talking about myself, since I have a regular income that comprises of my salary as well as some income from my dividends and other investments, I would give myself a score of 8 in this aspect. Parameter number 3, age. The younger the person, the higher the risk appetite of the investor, since that gives a higher runway and a potentially higher investment horizon. Since I am in my early 20s right now and I have a long investment horizon ahead of me, I can give myself a very high score and even a score of 10 in this aspect. Parameter number 4, time horizon. As mentioned previously, that younger the person, higher the potential time horizon and higher is the risk appetite, and obviously, so higher is your time horizon of your investment, higher is your risk appetite, because that allows you to make riskier bets and in anticipation of higher returns over a long period of time. And as I mentioned before, that since I am in my early 20s and I have a long investment horizon ahead of me, again in this aspect I can give myself a score of 10. Parameter number 5, primary earner. This parameter helps us understand whether other people are dependent on your income, and obviously more the number of people who are dependent on you and your income, lower is your risk appetite. And obviously in my case, since I'm not the primary earner of my family and I do not have any dependents to look after, I have a high risk appetite, and this increases my risk appetite, and as a result I can give myself a score of 9 in this aspect. Parameter number 6, reliance on the portfolio if it goes down by 50%. Say that this portfolio is a substantial part of the investor's overall wealth and assets, and say if this portfolio goes down by 50% or so, then that could be highly detrimental for the investor's survival and meeting his or her needs. And in that case, the investor would have a quite low risk appetite. And however, in my case, this is not true, and as a result, I could give myself a score of 9 in this aspect. Parameter number 7, investment objective. If the investment is made to achieve a specific non negotiable goal, then that might reduce your risk appetite. Therefore, investments with goals such as long term wealth creation may render a higher risk appetite as compared to investments that have a very specific goal, such as buying a house or buying a car. And in my case, since I am an investor purely for wealth creation purposes and not for any specific purposes which is non-negotiable, so I would give myself a score of 9 in this case. Parameter number 8, return expectations. Higher the expected returns, higher is the risk appetite, and lower your return expectations, lower is the risk appetite. And in my case, since I'm in my early 20s and I'm seeking out for high returns around 20-30%, so I might have I would have a high risk appetite, since I would be willing to invest in high risk growth equities such as tech stocks, etc., and also in other booming assets such as cryptocurrencies, etc., in order to achieve those high returns. And as a result, I might render myself a score of 9 in this aspect. Parameter number 9, volatility. Some investors might not be that comfortable with high volatility in their investments, and as a result, their risk appetite might reduce. And vice versa, if an investor is comfortable with high volatility in their investments, then obviously their risk appetite would increase. And in my case, as I mentioned previously, that I'm seeking out for higher returns, and in that case I'm comfortable investing in risky assets, and so I'm comfortable with high volatility in my portfolio, and as a result I would give myself a score of 9 in this aspect as well. Parameter number 10, experience as an investor. So an investor having experience and knowledge of investments and markets would obviously be assigned a high score in this aspect. And obviously an investor with a 10 to 15 years of experience in the markets would have a lot higher risk appetite as compared to an investor who has been in the market since the past 6 to 7 months. And talking about myself, I've been an investor in the market since the past 3 to 4 years, and at the same time I also hold a bachelor's degree in finance, and I'm also a CFA program candidate, and so I consider myself to have a fairly decent understanding and knowledge of finance and investments, and thus I would render myself a score of 9 in this aspect. Parameter number 11, future income sources. So if the stability and the amount of the investor's income is expected to go north in the future, then his or her risk appetite would increase. It is because he would be dependent on his or her future income for meeting his or her future needs. And talking about myself, that since this is just the onset of my professional career, and I feel that, and since that I also have a job right now, I feel that my income would be quite stable in the coming years, and at the same time it will increase gradually as I progressed and develop professionally. So considering those aspects, I would give myself a score of 8 in this aspect. Parameter number 12, scenario testing. So is the investor happy with very high returns and very high losses, or is he only happy with high returns and low losses? If so, then his or her risk appetite would reduce quite a lot. Talking about myself, I would be quite happy with a return of 20 to 30%, but at the same time a loss of around 15 to 20% would not make me that distracted or disheartened, and I would be prepared for that. And however, at the same time, I would not be wanting to take excessive risks and excessive losses of around 50-60% in order to achieve even higher returns, and as a result I would give myself a score of 9 in this parameter. Parameter number 13, liquidity needs. Does the investor require liquidating his or her portfolio investments in order to meet any of his needs? If not so, then it would be better to stay invested, and that would allow us to make riskier bets. Talking about myself, I am an investor from a long term wealth creation perspective, and as a result, I do not require liquidating any of my portfolio investments to meet any of my needs, and so I would give myself a score of 9 in this aspect. All the 13 parameters with a maximum score of 10, the total achievable score is 130, and so you need to divide your score by 130 to get a percentage, and that percentage should be used to determine your risk profile. So based on the total score that you achieve, we've divided the investor profiles into 5 main categories. So if your score is from 0 to 20% of the total achievable score, then you would be considered a highly conservative investor. If your score is between 20 to 40%, then you would be considered as moderately conservative. If the score is similarly between 40 to 60%, then you would be considered as a moderate investor type. And if your score is from 60 to 80%, then you would be considered as moderately aggressive. And if your score is from 80 to 100%, then in that case you would be considered as an aggressive investor. And based on the score that you get, we will create an optimal allocation strategy for your portfolio. So for example, based on the scores that I told you for the individual parameters, my total score is around 116, and 116 divided by 130 is around 88%, and as a result I would be placed in the aggressive investor category, and based on that I will get my optimal allocation for my portfolio, which I'm going to show you shortly in the Excel sheet. If you observe, then all these factors when taken in totality covered all the elements affecting the investor's response to his or her portfolio in the various scenarios that can be thought of. And the crux of this matter is to systematically evaluate each and every way in which an investor would react to his or her portfolio under different circumstances, and thereby rationally determining his or her risk profile. So this will help us create a risk profile for the investor, and based on that ideally come up with an allocation for their overall investment portfolio. So let's look at the Excel sheet now. So as I mentioned that based on the total score for all the 13 parameters, I got a score of 116, which is around 88%. So let me just add my risk score of 88% over here, and so this is updated here, and this shows that with a risk score of 88%, my risk profile is highly aggressive, and based on that they've come up with a portfolio allocation between debt and gold, which is considered as safe haven assets, plus equity, which is little risk, and cryptocurrencies, the emerging digital assets, which are considered the riskiest. And based on my risk score and my risk profile, they've given me an allocation of 12% of my portfolio into safe havens such as debt and fixed income instruments and gold, and around 69.9, and that is 70% of my allocation of my portfolio into equity, that is stocks and other equity instruments, and lastly around 18% to cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, etc. Now if I just change the risk score to say 55, then this automatically changes the risk profile as well, and it gets changed from aggressive to moderate. And now again the allocations have changed. The allocation for obviously the safe haven assets has increased slightly to 45%, and for equity it has gone down from 70 to 53.1%, and for cryptos it has gone down substantially from 18% for aggressive to with a risk score of 88% to an allocation of 1.9% for a moderate risk profile with a risk score of 55. So this was all about risk profiling, and you could see how an optimal portfolio of different asset classes can be created based on your risk profile, and how this subjective term risk can be easily quantified by answering these few questions and creating a scorecard to have a better, well diversified portfolio that meets your optimal needs.